The topic for now is culture. When we talk about culture, this is something that is just very, very basic to sociology. There are differences in culture. Why does someone end up living in a yurt? Or why does somebody have the capability, the ability to go to this lovely little spot with the pool that just looks so gorgeous? Now, I am not saying that one is better than the other, but if you take a look at just these pictures, you might be able to extrapolate from those pictures some of the culture that they represent. Let's see if you can do that by the end of this. Again, we're back to culture and this basic definition of a concept in sociology. Now, I've listed out a few different definitions here for you, but notice how comprehensive they all are, how much they include. This isn't just opera and music and art. Culture is ideas and beliefs, values, the stuff we can feel, the stuff we can taste, yeah, food's included, that's involved in a society. So as you read these, take a look and just realize how all-encompassing they are, but that the culture in every one of these definitions is linked to a society. One culture, one society. Now here's a really easy definition of culture: all that man learns to do in society. That's the definition. Culture gives us the blueprint of how to build our lives within that society, of what to do. It helps us make sense of it. But remember, just as you can't use one blueprint for a house and in order to build a super Walmart, you can't use one blueprint in all societies. Each society has a blueprint, a culture for that society. If you change and you move to a different society, think a different country, then your blueprint's got to be different in order to survive, in order to thrive in that culture. They are not interchangeable. A lot of things happen with culture that are almost done by osmosis. We just don't think about it. It's taken for granted. So much of what our culture is defined for us. We don't question it. It's just the way it is. It's often the way that we feel is natural or normal, but in reality, it's simply what we're used to. It's what we have been taught in our society in order to function, and that's our culture. What's included in culture, as I mentioned, you name it. Anything in that society, whether it's actions or values, morals, art, law, everything's a part of culture. Now, some are more important than others, but they all are a part. If something is instinctual, if it's part of our instinct, then it would not be included in culture. If it's something that's learned within society, then it is cultural. This equation is pretty simple. Now, I do want you to make sure that you understand the basic definition of a society, of any society. It's a fairly large grouping of people. It's not just a couple of individuals. The group of people has to share a similar culture, has to share the culture of that society. They are under the same political authority, and 9 times out of 10, there's a territory, a geography that goes with it. Now, every once in a while, that doesn't take place. But if a society sees themselves as different, then they are. The society simply equals the people that we're talking about. The culture is everything that the people have learned. It's everything that the people in that society do. Okay? So whenever there's a society, there's a culture. Whenever there's a culture, there's a society. Here's some 4 basic qualities of culture. Now, I'm not sure your text talked about it this way, so you might want to pay attention. But if you look at them, and they're in no particular order, as I mentioned, culture is learned. It's not instinctual. It's stuff that we learn to do. Again, we learn a lot of it almost by osmosis. We don't really stop and think about it. A culture is shared. let's face it, if you've got a culture of one, well, that's something for a psychiatrist, not for a sociologist to study. We're talking about shared culture between a fairly large number of people. A culture has to be adaptive. If it doesn't change, it's very likely to die out, unless it's unusual enough to be completely isolated. But those days really do seem to be gone. And now, cultures seem to change, seem to adapt faster than ever. Lastly, cultures are extremely symbolic. Almost everything within a culture stands for something. It represents something else that's a little deeper. When you see something material, it probably also stands for something non-material, and we'll get to that in a second. There are two basic terms that anybody in sociology really ought to understand. Ethnocentrism, which is simply when you judge everything by your own standards. All of us do this. You can't get away from it. If your initial reaction to a food or a type of clothing or some jewelry or adornment or maybe a way of life is yuck, then you're experiencing ethnocentrism and you're acting that way. It's natural. If you look at the opposite of it, we're talking about cultural relativism. Now, this is a little tougher to do. This is when you try to understand the standards of that culture by that culture. So you try to put yourself in the shoes of somebody within that culture, whether it's at a different nation or a different time frame. That's also part of relativism. Trying to understand how these people recognize and work through the material culture that they have. So if you think of, a really basic example might be the veil in Iran, or it might be the sacred cow in India. If you judge it by our standards, it's ethnocentric. If you try to understand it by the standards of the Iranian or the Indian culture, then you're trying to be culturally relative. Now, I do want to remember and refresh your memory if you've already read the textbook, but don't forget, ethnocentrism is not completely bad. It does have positive effects. We all use our own standards and end up with a feeling of pride, a feeling of cohesiveness. If you're patriotic, well, you're ethnocentric. Again, it's not a horrible thing to be. Just don't take it to the extreme. I want to throw in a little caveat here on cultural relativism and objectivity. I feel, and part of this certainly is my opinion as well, but often we take cultural relativism a little bit too far. You can understand what happens in another culture, and you can try to judge it in the other culture. But just because something is appropriate in one place, it does not mean that it's appropriate in the other. Remember, culture goes with society. If the society changes, then what happened in that culture is probably not going to fit in the new society. You do not have to agree with the values and norms and customs of another culture in order to understand it. Just because something is okay somewhere in the world does not mean that it's okay here. So try to attempt to understand, but then decide. There are things that are right and wrong, especially in our society. Another term that's brought up often is xenocentrism, and this is the opposite of ethnocentrism. If you're xenocentric, then everything outside your own culture, everything foreign, is better than your own. It's as though your own culture is inferior. Now, again, as a personal comment here, and only my opinion, sometimes I wonder if Americans might have gone a little xenocentric. We seem to be apologizing for everything that we've done in the past. This may extend to the, quote, white race, unquote. Apologies, thinking other things are foreign, Again, in my opinion, don't take it to the extreme, but be sure for this course you understand the term. We'll throw in a couple of other really quick ones that I don't think are going to take much time. If you have a homogeneous culture, a homogeneous population, the people are all very similar. If you're heterogeneous, then they're very different. Quick question, which culture, a homogeneous one or a heterogeneous one, has less friction? Well, by definition, the more homogeneous a culture is, the more homogeneous a society is, the easier it is to live in that society. If this doesn't make sense, if anything that I say in these little lectures don't make sense or you have a question, please don't hesitate. Pop me an email, post something at the discussion board. I want to be sure that these lectures add to what you've read in your book. The other two quick terms, material culture and non-material culture. If there's anything in that society that you can touch, see, even taste or smell, then you're looking at something material, something tangible. Non-material culture, ideas, beliefs, values. Okay, everybody got it? It's pretty easy to see material culture, but to really understand it, and thus to understand that society, you have to understand the link that material culture has to non-material. That's where you need to do a little thinking. Okay? Two more quick terms and two of my favorite ones. Culture lag. Oh my gosh, are we in it? There are tons and tons of examples. I tend to think now that we're in permanent culture lag. When things change faster than the values and norms can do. Think of material culture changing faster than what you know to be right or wrong can change. Think of technology that changes faster than the laws can. So if you think about a material culture that allows for cloning, allows for stem cell research, allows for prolonging or ending life, we're in culture lag if our values and our expected behavior hasn't caught up with that material culture. There's tons and tons of examples of this, and you should be able to come up with some that you feel on a personal note. Culture shock, that tends to be felt much less often. You can usually see it when you travel to another culture, to another society. But real culture shock isn't just that things are different. A real culture shock leaves you going, oh my God, I have no idea what to do. I'm very disoriented. This means you really can't make sense of it. You see the symbols, you see the culture around you, and you don't know how to respond. Because remember, your blueprint doesn't work here. It often has to elicit an emotional response to really fit the level of culture shock. If you have traveled at all, you may have some good examples of this. You may have some lesser examples if you have traveled to either other parts of this country. Think about the Deep South, or maybe if you've traveled to Alaska. If you're looking at different parts even of this culture, you can get a little bit of this, but it doesn't usually rise to this level. Plop me down in the middle of Saudi Arabia, and I'm going to be in culture shock. Not just as a female, but for everything else. Okay? Making sense? A couple of really basic things here, and maybe the more difficult part of this section is really, it's difficult if you think about it. Values and norms are not the same. They are not interchangeable. When you think about a value, it is usually something very vague, very up in the clouds, things that we feel are good or bad, general guidelines for beliefs. They're something that we feel are ethical, moral, but in a very general sense. A belief is when you get much more specific about this. you don't kill people. Well, that might be a belief. The moral part, the value part, would go beyond that as to why. Now notice I said kill. I probably should have said murder. Everybody with me? Pop me an email if you're not. Norms are simply the expected, accepted behavior of society. And those are things that we just kind of know what to do. Your book does a good job on folkways. Those are less important. Those aren't the real big deal. That's kind of don't sweat the small stuff. Mores, notice the pronunciation, those are much stronger feelings. They elicit, oh, you can't do that. That's wrong, with a capital WRONG. Okay? Laws are simply formal, written sanctions and norms. Now, this is the one I want you to think about a little bit. This is more important. It's the relationship. If you look at any of the smaller boxes there, they should all be based on values. If you have a law, so think about something that's against the law, especially against criminal law, might be easier. Hopefully, if your society is working correctly, if your culture is in sync, then the laws will link back to some beliefs and to some values. The same thing with norms, mores, and folkways. Look at these actions, but try to think about what value they represent. Now, this one takes some thought. If there's a law, if there's an accepted behavior, why do you hold the door open for somebody? That's a norm. That should reflect, that should be based on a value. Maybe the value is respect. Okay? Moving on. Naturally, values and norms and all the other things certainly do change. But those mores and taboos change more slowly because they're often universal and strongly held. Norms certainly do change. Norms that are prescriptive tell you what you can't do. Norms that are prescriptive tell you what you should do. And boy, have those changed. I have to admit, I still like the old days when we had a prescriptive norm that said, take your hat off indoors. That's not the case anymore. That's changed. Okay? But all these norms help us make sense of our culture, of our society, help us to navigate. Now, another one I want you to think about a little bit are formal and informal norms. Okay? Again, accepted standards of behavior. The formal norms, things that we just kind of know that they're set down, this is how you act, this is what you do, tend to be a little easier to understand. But think about informal norms. Think about a group. Maybe a powerful group, or maybe a religious group, or maybe an occupational group that also has some informal norms about what's accepted and what isn't. If you can read the informal norms and understand that behavior, it is probably going to be extremely useful to you in whatever setting those informal norms occur in. Again, whether it's in work or church or wherever it might be. So give some thought, be ready to come up with some examples. To enforce norms, we have the written laws that always include some kind of punishment. It may have to be through the courts, but it's punishment. Remember, and your book does a good job, that sanctions are both positive and negative. They're good and they're bad. You have positive sanctions that say, good job, you get a blue ribbon or whatever it might be. And of course you have negative sanctions. And we tend to usually think of sanctions in a negative term. Today, it certainly seems that society and culture relies more on laws, on those written laws, than we ever did before. And it might be because the informal norms, right with me? The informal sanctions, especially of shame, of guilt, don't seem to work anymore. Why are people not feeling guilty about what they do anymore? Why are they not ashamed if something is wrong? And I put that wrong in quotation marks if you could see me. Perhaps it has to do with culture lag. The American values part of the text, you can read these. I'm not going through those. But as a hint, make sure you have some ideas about which one of those American values you agree and disagree with. Maybe you've got an idea of which ones from that list you feel are the most and least important. Think that might be a hint? Okay. Cultural values do shape the way people see the world. If you're from a culture that values one thing, your view of the world is going to be different than a culture that has a high value on another. If you emphasize individual achievement the way we do, then you see it in our norms. Our behavior is individualistic. Think about the way we care for older people. That might get you thinking when you think of other cultures. Everywhere, in every society, in every culture, values are important. We seldom stop as individuals to question those values. We've internalized them. We've grown up with them. Sometimes values are really hard to put into words. And if somebody asks you, well, what's that based on, or why do you react to it that way? And you just can't, you can't put it into words. You say, well, because it's right or because it's wrong. Then you know you're talking about values. Give it some thought. Try to put some words to that. Remember, values are not the same. Even in being culturally relative, you recognize it. The culture wars of recent times, especially since 9/11, have increased this terminology something fierce. Let's try to understand it. This is the end of part 1. Make sure you go to part 2.